David Ricardo, why the better cook should still hire help. Here is a claim that sounds almost impossible the first time you hear it. A country can benefit from trading with another country, even if that other country is worse at making literally everything. That is not a typo, and it is not a trick.
It is one of the few genuinely counterintuitive ideas in all of economics that turns out to actually hold up, and we owe it to a man who was not primarily an academic at all.
Tell us who David Ricardo actually was, because he is a very different character from the professors we have covered so far.
Ricardo made his fortune as a stockbroker and bond trader in London in the early 1800s, reportedly retiring fabulously wealthy in his early 40s after some extremely well-timed trading around the outcome of the Battle of Waterloo. Only after that did he turn seriously to economics, eventually becoming a member of parliament and one of the sharpest theoretical minds of his generation. This matters because Ricardo was not theorizing about markets from a comfortable distance. He had actually lived inside the pressure, risk, and incentives of real financial markets before he ever wrote a word of theory about them.
So walk us through the big idea, comparative advantage, using his own famous example.
Ricardo's classic illustration involves England and Portugal, cloth and wine. Imagine Portugal can produce both cloth and wine using less labor than England needs for either one, meaning Portugal has what economists call an absolute advantage in both goods. You would think Portugal should simply make everything itself and never bother trading. Ricardo's insight is that what actually matters is not absolute advantage, but comparative advantage, the relative cost of making one good instead of the other, inside each country. If Portugal is especially dramatically better at wine and only moderately better at cloth, it should pour its effort into wine and let England focus on cloth, even though England is worse at both. Trade the surplus, and both countries end up with more total wine and cloth combined than either could produce alone.
That is the theory. Now give us the honest historical reality check, because you mentioned this example gets messier the closer you look.
Considerably messier, and good historians are upfront about it. The real historical trade relationship between England and Portugal, following the Methuen Treaty of 1703, was not some tidy, mutually beneficial arrangement between equals. Portugal's wine industry benefited, but its textile industry arguably suffered under the terms, and the overall relationship left England with considerably more structural bargaining power. Ricardo's example was always a simplified thought experiment to illustrate a mathematical principle, not a faithful economic history of that particular trade relationship, and treating it as literal history rather than a teaching model gives comparative advantage more real-world validation than that one case actually earned.
Ricardo also had a major theory about rent, which sounds like a strange thing for an economist to get famous for.
It sounds mundane, but it was genuinely important, and it grew directly out of a live political fight, the Corn Laws. Britain had tariffs restricting cheap imported grain to protect domestic landowners, and Ricardo argued forcefully against them. His theory of rent explained that as a growing population forced farmers onto progressively less fertile land to grow enough food, the price of grain would rise, and landowners sitting on the best, most fertile land would collect an ever larger, mostly unearned windfall, simply from owning the good land, not from any productive effort of their own. For Ricardo, tariffs protecting that arrangement mainly enriched landlords at the direct expense of everyone else, workers and manufacturers alike, and he became one of the most influential voices for repealing them, which Parliament finally did in 1846, a year after his death.
There is also the labor theory of value, which gets tangled up with Marx in a lot of people's minds. How different was Ricardo's version?
This is a genuinely important distinction, and worth being precise about. Ricardo used a labor theory of value mainly as an analytical tool. Roughly, the relative prices of goods tend to track the relative amount of labor required to produce them, particularly for reproducible goods in competitive markets. Marx, writing decades later, took a similar starting vocabulary and built an entirely different edifice on top of it, arguing that because labor creates value, Profit itself represents value extracted from workers without full compensation, the foundation of his theory of exploitation. Ricardo never drew that conclusion, and would likely have resisted large parts of it. Same starting phrase, genuinely different theories, built for different purposes.
Let us bring this down to something people can actually picture, because comparative advantage is famously hard to feel intuitively.
Here is the cleanest version. Imagine a genuinely brilliant chef who happens to also be the fastest, most skilled person in the kitchen at chopping vegetables, faster than any prep cook you could possibly hire. Does it make sense for that chef to spend an hour each morning chopping onions personally? Almost never, because that hour is worth vastly more spent developing the menu, running the kitchen, and cooking the dishes only that chef can really elevate. Hiring a cheaper prep assistant to chop, even one who chops more slowly, frees up the chef's most valuable hours for the chef's most valuable work. That is comparative advantage, not about who is better at everything, but about where each person's relative advantage is largest.
And this is not some abstract historical debate. It is dominating trade policy conversations right now, in 2026.
It absolutely is, and this is where we owe Ricardo's theory an honest, complicated accounting, rather than either blind faith or blanket rejection. Decades of trade liberalization following Ricardo's basic logic, including agreements like NAFTA and its successor, delivered real, measurable gains, lower consumer prices, greater overall economic output, genuine efficiency gains across entire economies. But the so-called China trade shock of the 2000s is the other half of the honest story, a period where a surge of manufacturing imports delivered those broad efficiency gains while imposing severe, concentrated, and genuinely lasting costs on specific American manufacturing communities, entire towns that lost their major employers with far less capacity to adjust or relocate than trade models had assumed.
So the theory was not simply wrong.
The theory was not wrong about the aggregate math. Total output really can rise from specialization and trade, exactly as Ricardo argued. What classical trade theory badly underestimated was how unevenly those gains and losses would land, and how slowly, if ever, displaced workers and communities would actually be compensated or successfully retrained, despite economists' long-standing promise that the winners could in principle compensate the losers. That gap between the elegant aggregate theory and the messy, uneven-lived reality is exactly what is fueling today's tariff and reshoring debates. Real disagreement among serious economists and policymakers about whether the 21st century needs more trade along Ricardo's logic, more protection against its uneven costs, or some genuinely difficult combination of both.
It is also worth noting Ricardo did not just theorize about markets from the sidelines, even after he became famous.
As a member of parliament, he was known for backing his arguments with genuinely rigorous, sometimes dense economic reasoning in a chamber far more accustomed to rhetoric than mathematics, and colleagues occasionally complained his speeches were more like lectures than debate. He also continued advising on financial and monetary questions right up to his death in 1823, still treating economics as a discipline that ought to be tested against hard evidence, not simply argued from elegant first principles.
That is a very honest place to land, no tidy verdict.
Which is exactly how Ricardo himself would probably want it left, given he was a working financier before he was ever a theorist, someone comfortable with real uncertainty rather than false precision. His mathematics on comparative advantage remains genuinely sound and genuinely important. What happens to the specific communities and specific workers along the way remains a live, contested, and very human problem that the elegant math alone was never built to solve.
Which brings us to Ricardo's closest intellectual sparring partner, someone who spent years in friendly, relentless disagreement with him over an entirely different question, not how nations should trade, but whether population growth itself was quietly sabotaging any progress trade could deliver.
Where Ricardo was fundamentally optimistic that trade and specialization could keep expanding the pie, our next thinker was deeply worried the pie could never actually keep up with how fast the number of mouths at the table kept growing.
Next time, Thomas Malthus, and the grim arithmetic of population that terrified an entire generation, and the very real question of whether it was ever fully proven wrong. See you then.